for the next 10 days or so visiting my brother who works at NASA. And this is going to be a short 30-minute live stream lecture. And I promised you guys last week that I was going to give a brief explainer explaining Žižek's death drive Marxism. And so that's what this video is going to be. It's going to be a short explanation video giving you the basic components of what you might call Žižek's death drive Marxism. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I see Brazil. Hello, Brazil. Would very much enjoy going there. I visited Sao Paulo a while back. I was at the university there. It was quite interesting. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, so this is going to be a short 30-minute lecture. And if you'd like to download my current ebook, which is called The Night of the World, and if you'd like to also get access to the next ebook that's coming out on the 1st of the next month, the 1st of May, which is going to be on the death drive, you can find that on my Patreon. I'm going to be making a couple changes to the Patreon coming up soon. In fact, I think I'm going to be making the entire collected guide to Žižek available next month. So keep your eyes out for that. I'm going to ask Jeneline if she can help me figure out the logistics. And I see someone joining from Egypt, so hello, Egypt. I'm also going to host a Q&A seminar right after this on Patreon, which I'm also going to post as a podcast for members on Patreon. So there's that. You are cordially invited to join us. Okay, so let's launch right in. Let's begin. What is Slavoj Žižek's death drive Marxism, which is how he's sometimes alluded to his own Marxism? The simplest way to put it is that Žižek's death drive Marxism is an analysis of capital and the ideology of capitalism seen through the lens of, or the logic of, the pleasure principle. And so what I'm going to do in this video is essentially explain what the pleasure principle is, how Lacan argues that we go beyond the pleasure principle, and how this relates to death drive. In fact, the death drive can be described as the logic of the pleasure principle. Therefore, Žižek's critique of capitalism, his Marxist stance, is one that is deeply informed by psychoanalysis, by Lacanian psychoanalysis in particular. And if you're curious about Žižek's own development, essentially what happened is that Žižek was originally a Heideggerian, and then he started reading Derrida, and Derrida became a way for him to reframe Heidegger. And that's when he was introduced to Lacan, namely through Jacques-Alain Miller. And Žižek is quite frank about the fact that his knowledge of Lacan is based mostly on Jacques-Alain Miller's interpretation of Lacan. And this is sort of like how Žižek then ends up being able to go back to Hegel, etc. But for the purpose of this video, I want to keep it very accessible. I'm going to try to explain it bit by bit without too much philosophical jargon. Okay, so first of all, what is the pleasure principle? Essentially, the pleasure principle is an idea formulated by Freud, where the simplest version of it is that as human beings, we want to essentially enjoy, right? We want to enhance our pleasure. And the pleasure principle holds that the things that we have to do in order to survive are pleasurable. Like when we eat food, it tastes good, or when we go to the bathroom to relieve ourselves, it feels good, etc. And so we have pain or discomfort when there are things that we need, like hunger or having to go to the bathroom. And then there's the pleasure that we derive from sating our bodily needs. Essentially, it's an incentive that our brain gives us so that we do what's necessary. Now, of course, Freud isn't the first person to formulate this idea in those terms. Instead, Freud uses the idea of the pleasure principle to talk about what he calls desire, or the pleasure principle as the central formula of desire. Desire is there is something that you need and you desire it because it is lost. For example, primordial form of desire for Freud is that the child desires to be with the mother. The child wants to be at the mother's breast. And one of the things that Lacan does quite well is Lacan essentially radicalizes Freud. Lacan says that we go beyond the pleasure principle, which is to say, we don't simply desire X, but we want to keep on desiring, which is to say we go beyond the original pursuit of the object towards a kind of drive that revolves around an impossible object, as it were. To go back again to the figure of the mother, the child desires to be at the mother's breast so as to acquire milk, which it needs for nourishment. But we go beyond the pleasure principle when the child enjoys sucking on the breast for its own sake. In other words, when the child sucks its own thumb, or when the child has a pacifier. And this is the transition from desire to drive, or how we go beyond the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle, which revolves around desire, transitions beyond the pleasure principle into an undead, eternal recurrence around something which is by definition supposed to be never-ending or impossible, i.e. the child that sucks its thumb isn't sucking its thumb for nourishment, but for the sake of the sucking itself. This means that Lacan's basic observation is that desire isn't about loss of the object of desire, it's about lack. It's about a certain fundamental constitutive negativity. In fact, the central logic of the death drive, being the underlying idea of going beyond the pleasure principle, is precisely this constitutive negativity, which for Žižek is quite important for his Hegelian interpretation. But we'll leave that for another video. So the basic point is this: the pleasure principle revolves around the logic of desire, namely we have an object of desire that has to be fulfilled. Whereas when we go beyond the pleasure principle, we essentially have a logic that revolves around lack, a logic that revolves around desire for desire itself, an eternally recurring desire that by definition is supposed to be never satisfied. Schopenhauer was actually one of the first people to formulate this quite well when he said that money and fame are like seawater. The more we drink of it, the more thirsty we become. And that's essentially, again, what Lacan means by going beyond the pleasure principle. We don't achieve money or fame for in their own right. The fact that you achieve fame means you want more fame. You become addicted to it. When you acquire money, you want more money. You want money for the sake of having money, fame for the sake of having fame. In fact, by definition, there's nothing concrete to fame, except the idea that you would have to be known by more people, and you would have to stay relevant, etc. This means that we enjoy something in the abstract, not in the concrete. And this is what Žižek calls the objet A of capitalist ideology. For example, in the same way that Schopenhauer argues that money and fame are like seawater, when you drink it, they make you more thirsty, Žižek says that the ultimate version of this in contemporary consumer societies is Coca-Cola. That Coca-Cola is a drink that is supposed to make you more thirsty, that's really enjoyable and delicious to drink, and yet by itself is simply a black liquid that doesn't actually fill you up or sate your thirst. It simply makes you want more. This means that for Žižek, it's the ultimate commodity because it represents this death drive. That you consume something not for what it is, but so as to consume more of it. I've used this example many times before, but there's a great scene in South Park where Cartman's family adopts a young African child who they dub Starvin' Marvin. And at a certain point, Cartman is explaining American culture to this emaciated young African man. And he shows him an appetizer, and he says, "In America, this is what we eat to make us more hungry." And here again, we have the consumer item as an empty commodity, as it were, as a commodity of the death drive. An object that you eat that is supposed to make you more hungry. The point of the appetizer isn't that it fills you up, it's that you want to eat more of it. In fact, I think you could argue that when it comes to contemporary American restaurants, or fast food restaurants specifically, the implicit value proposition used to be that you would never leave hungry. But now it's changed to you will never leave satisfied, i.e. you will always be able to keep on eating more. The quintessential version of this in the United States is the all-you-can-eat buffet. The all-you-can-eat buffet is a symptom of this excessive death drive. You're not there for a specific type of food. You're there to eat everything to excess, to keep eating more and more of it. And Žižek's basic argument is that this principle, which you might call going beyond the pleasure principle, is the central underlying logic within capitalism. That not only as consumers do we buy so as to buy more, like you buy an iPhone that you then immediately replace with another iPhone. I saw an advertisement recently where the basic pitch of the ad was that if you showed your phone to somebody, they'd be so repulsed that your phone was 2 years old that they wouldn't want to, like, they'd want to not talk to you. Like a mother who covers their children's eyes because the child shouldn't see the obscenity of somebody's old phone, i.e. we buy commodities so as to simply trade them in for new ones. It's like people who don't buy cars to use them for 20 years, they lease them so that they can keep getting the newest model, as it were. Zizek's argument, therefore, is this is what happens on the level of the consumer society, but it replicates or mirrors the central logic of the commodity as capital itself. In other words, capital is the ultimate non-commodity, the ultimate dematerialized abstract form of the commodity. In fact, Zizek's basic argument is that the commodity in the form of capital is the real of capitalism. So capital is the real of capitalism in psychoanalytic terms, and consumer objects are the material embodiment of this real in the shape of the objet A. And I've done an introduction to the objet A before, but it's important to note here that the objet A for Lacan is not simply the object of desire, but it is the object cause of desire. In other words, it's the underlying principle within an object that serves not to sate our desire, but to make us want more. In the same way that the appetizer is given to you so that you might become more hungry, the objet A isn't about the material thing, it's about its structural relation to the other thing, to the perpetually postponed moment of gratification, as it were. In fact, this is Lacan's theory of surplus enjoyment, essentially, that surplus enjoyment is the enjoyment that we derive above and beyond the material quantities of the thing. It's the perpetual horizon or promise of more. But I want to stay a little bit more focused on the overall argument. The overall argument is, why does Žižek characterize himself as a death drive Marxist? And so here we have all the basic components. I'll lay them out again once more for you in simplified form. The death drive is the logic of lack, which is the logic of the objet A, the eternal recurrence, the way in which our desire doesn't revolve around an object of desire, but around desire itself, which is to say, it is how we go beyond the pleasure principle. This means that Žižek applies this idea of the pleasure principle to his analysis of the commodity and of the ideology, and to the ideology of capitalism. And so the simplest way to explain Slavoj Žižek's death drive Marxism is that it is a psychoanalytic interpretation of the central fetish object of capitalism, namely capital itself. And that's the basic argument, but I'm gonna try to explain it in a little bit more detail to give you a little bit more insight here. So one of Žižek's basic arguments, I've mentioned this before, is that we increasingly in our societies become attached to things devoid of their central kernel. For example, coffee without caffeine, pastries without sugar or without gluten. Pornography is essentially sex without actually having to do it yourself. And Žižek says, he actually writes about this or talks about this in one of his interviews, which is a book called Conversations with Žižek. He says that, in a sense, we are like the Nietzschean last man. After all, the Nietzschean last man is the man who wants a revolution without revolution, a man who no longer has a fundamental passion or a historical responsibility towards any one cause. The Nietzschean last man simply lives for hedonistic excess. And Žižek essentially argues that this is the postmodern ethic, which is to say that the postmodern ethic is that our primary responsibility is to ourselves, to our own happiness and our own pleasure. That fundamentally we're not supposed to care about any overarching historical or political projects. We're supposed to enhance our own enjoyment and our own productivity. That we worship at the altar of ourselves, a kind of narcissistic pursuit. But the problem is that in a weird way, this doesn't actually make us happy. This doesn't actually in any way fulfill us. And so we become neurotic subjects, constantly looking for some edge that is going to give us purpose or meaning in our life. And when Žižek says that for the Nietzschean last man, who wants a revolution without a revolution, when he says that, he's essentially likening this to a lot of liberal progressivism, which is to say, if you wear a Che Guevara shirt, it's like you're having a revolution without a revolution. If you post on social media for whatever social cause or concern about conflicts in the world, this essentially is a revolution without a revolution. We want coffee without caffeine. We want revolution without actually going to the streets. And Žižek says that we therefore exist in a kind of like malaise of disenchantment, as it were, which is to say, we feel like somehow we're not able to access the core of things. And in a sense, this means that everything becomes virtual, right? The thing about virtual reality is that it's supposed to be a simulacrum of reality. Virtual reality is to reality what decaffeinated coffee is to caffeine. It's supposed to be a place where we can live out our fantasies without consequences. And yet the truth is that it doesn't actually make us happy. It doesn't actually make us fulfilled. In fact, a lot of people feel like they're missing out on some of the fundamental aspects of life. For example, Alain Badiou, who's a close colleague and friend of Žižek, makes a similar argument when it comes to relationships and dating apps. He says, on the one hand, it's become easier to meet people than ever before. Like, you can go on a dating app or even like a hookup app and have a romantic or sexual encounter within minutes or hours. And yet what's become much more difficult than ever before is to have a meaningful investment with someone, a meaningful relationship in which you don't get hurt. And so what presents itself as an abundance of sorts, as a liberation, i.e., a sexual liberation, you can be with anyone, actually means that it's very, very difficult to meet someone you want to spend the rest of your life with. And so what's promised to us as our own liberation is in effect an entrapment, so that it becomes harder for us to live. And Žižek's argument is quite consistent here. He says that often when we're promised freedom, like a choice between many different consumer items, we're not actually free to change the platform or the horizon on which those changes happen. And this means that we're constantly given the illusion of choice. Like, the ultimate example is when you go into a Starbucks, and in Starbucks, there's a million different ways that you can order your coffee, and you sort of learn to identify yourself predicated on how you structure your ideal fantasy coffee. This is part of this surplus enjoyment that capitalism gives us, this idea that we're free subjects, but fundamentally you're still alone by yourself sipping your frappuccino, watching YouTube videos and wishing that somehow your life had some form of meaning. And so it means that we don't actually get to change the way in which we meet people. Instead, we're simply given the illusion of choice by means of given more options to choose between consumer goods or items. And fundamentally, this is an empty kind of satisfaction. Remember, I started with Schopenhauer's quote that money and fame are like seawater. The more you drink of them, the more thirsty you become. And in a weird way, the same is true when it comes to our social connections. Like, let's say that you're on Facebook. The promise of Facebook and social media is that we're supposed to be less alone and more connected. And yet the opposite is true. The more time we spend, quote unquote, connecting with people on social media, the more alienated and isolated we feel. The more access we have to the internet that's supposed to give us the truth about everything, the more we become bombarded with disinformation. The more we're exposed to the suffering of others, the more difficult it becomes to observe the suffering of those in our own lives, etc. This is the fundamental paradox for Slavoj Žižek when it comes to contemporary so-called late-stage capitalism, that the illusion of choice is precisely what keeps us unfree. The illusion of abundance is precisely what gives us a form of spiritual poverty, as it were. Hence, of course, why certain symptomatic returns occur, which is to say minimalism becomes a trend online because suddenly people feel like the only way to enjoy going beyond the pleasure principle of having so much stuff is precisely to get rid of all of their stuff. This means that all the joy that we have becomes this symptomatic joy, a joy of going offline, off the grid, the joy of getting rid of our stuff. And yet fundamentally, once you've gone through the process of enjoyably decluttering or enjoyably going off the grid, you're still left with emptiness. Except now it's an empty home or it's being offline, but you don't know what to substitute it with. And essentially, therefore, Žižek's argument is that the logic of the consumer society in this empty drive of perpetual hedonistic excess, of trying to find surplus enjoyment, of making yourself the primary object of your ethical responsibility, mirrors the underlying principle of capital as an abstract thing which has to be pursued for itself. For example, Schopenhauer has another great aphorism about this, where Schopenhauer says, when you start trading in capital, you essentially lose the ability to enjoy money in the concrete, because now you can only enjoy money in the abstract. And that's what capital is fundamentally. It's money or value in the abstract. This is what Marx used to call the rational miser. It's the capitalist who lives essentially as if he were poor, because to spend money on things like vacations, etc., is a waste of money when it could also be invested in the stock market where it can gain more value. In fact, this all ties us together into a kind of mock fraternization. Recall how during the Robinhood GameStop situation, there was a genuine, it appeared, form of community around supposedly activist investors who would hold on to their assets as long as possible, thereby supposedly sending a message to the big brokerage firms. This, for Slavoj Žižek, is the ultimate pseudo-community, the ultimate pseudo-revolution. A revolution staged not against the powers that be, but a revolution staged on an online trading platform that mirrors the logic of capitalist investing. In fact, so-called activist investing is what Žižek would therefore call a pseudo-revolution, a kind of coffee without caffeine. We want to have it both ways, not a revolution against capitalism, but a revolution within capitalism. And the same logic for Žižek is therefore about the supplementary enjoyment that we get. Like I said before, pornography is like sex without actually having to risk having your feelings hurt. Or playing a video game is warfare without actually having to risk your personal safety. This means that we're constantly engaged in this kind of post-ethical, hedonistic, narcissistic pursuit of something that is a simulacrum of something else. And for Slavoj Žižek, this mirrors the logic of the death drive. The death drive isn't a movement towards death. It's the principle of death, of eternal recurrence within enjoyment as such, namely the transition from desire to lack, from loss to lack. I've done a lot of videos about this recently, like shorter videos where I break down the individual components, which you can find on YouTube, which might be helpful to look at. Now, I'd like to conclude here with Žižek's relationship towards Marxism, because everything that we've described so far is essentially part of the critique of ideology, which isn't, strictly speaking, related to Marxism. And I'm going to try to basically explain in under 10 minutes what Žižek's basic position is on Marxism. So Žižek has sometimes characterized himself as a reluctant Marxist, that he's more of a Hegelian than a Marxist. But at the same time, he's argued that the only reason he's interested in Hegel is to reframe Hegelian dialectics so as to conceptualize a new version of dialectical materialism, or the philosophy of Marxism. So in a sense, Žižek is a very committed theoretical Marxist, but perhaps a reluctant, orthodox, historically deterministic Marxist. But that makes sense, because after the tragedies of actually existing Marxism, like Stalinism, etc., the excesses that emerged from within the idea of Marxism, it's very difficult to say that you are a devout orthodox Marxist without appearing to be some kind of totalitarian madman at best, or a nostalgic fool at worst. Žižek therefore likes to say that Marxism is the pursuit of a lost cause, of a kind of historical failure, and that to persist in Marxism, therefore, is precisely to hold on to this notion that communism is inevitable, and that the tragedy of Marxism is itself part of this inevitability. But let me try to explain that, because I realize that's like a lot to put into one or two sentences. Žižek's basic position is that Marxism remains the only relevant frame through which to study capital and the accompanying ideology of capitalism. However, Žižek's central claim is that we have to fuse psychoanalysis with Marxism in order to do so. Because if we simply hold on to an outdated orthodox version of Marxism, we end up repeating the crimes of the past. We end up stuck in a kind of, if you will, neurotic attachment to or a disavowal of what happened with actually existing socialism, as it were. Žižek therefore says that to not view capitalism through the lens of Marxism is itself a kind of disavowal, that we're at a theoretical dead end. Therefore, to be a Marxist is to be stuck in a double bind. On the one hand, it remains the best, and for Žižek only, theoretically valid lens through which to interpret capitalism. And at the same time, to be a Marxist means to uphold the idea of some form of as of yet unimagined, unforeseen future, namely communism. And this is where Žižek, through Badiou, actually links the idea of communism back to a philosophical project, which is to say not communism as a political project, but as a philosophical idea. In fact, Žižek reconciles the idea of communism back with the goal or pursuit of German idealism and Platonic idealism, that communism is supposed to be a society, a utopian one, in which there is no contradiction, in which all differences are reconciled, as it were. And of course, the ultimate metaphysical contradiction, going back to Plato, was between appearances in the world and the ideal that existed on a transcendental horizon. In a strange sense, Žižek therefore re-philosophizes or brings back into dialectical tension the idea of dialectical materialism. And yet the way in which Žižek does this is by means of emphasizing the death drive or constitutive negativity, which is to say, Žižek is not a Maoist in any sense. Like, essentially one of the principles of Maoism was that contradiction was eternal and inevitable, and that therefore society had to always be at war with itself and brought into eternal rotating contradiction, therefore it would progress and communism would succeed. Žižek's argument is very different. For Slavoj Žižek, communism is the idea of a society in which its fundamental antagonisms are reconciled, in which they are transcended, as it were. And that this political society, therefore, would be one in which all differences would be surpassed. Now, of course, the question is, how would that look in real life? Like, what would that kind of a communism look like? And Slavoj Žižek actually argues that sooner or later, when we're faced with climate collapse, we will inevitably have to act collectively. We will have to act on a universal frame. This means that communism will become a kind of historical necessity. Of course, he's fully aware of the fact that as long as possible, we will cling on to our individualistic rights. We'll cling on to the idea that some people can survive in their air-conditioned spaces or their bunkers and other people will simply be torched alive. And yet fundamentally, if we want to survive as a species, it will no longer be sufficient to function according to the logic of capital, to the logic of private acquisition, the private ethos or ethic of surplus enjoyment, of going beyond the pleasure principle. Žižek's basic argument, therefore, is that this era in which we live, in which capitalism and the ideology of the death drive of capital, which supplements it, might appear to be eternal and yet is entirely transitory. His basic position is that whilst right now capital might seem like the insurpassable horizon of meaning, this will no longer be sustainable or possible. And that communism will therefore return as a possibility of conceptualizing a world in which capital is no longer the primary objet, the sublime object of ideology, as it were. I think this is actually, like, of course, this is a flawed argument to some extent because, like, we can't foresee the future. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that two of the central, like, unchangeable truths that we experience today are entirely modern. The idea of capital is a relatively modern phenomena, and the idea of the nation state is an entirely novel phenomena. In fact, even when Marx was writing, the centrality of nationalism wasn't nearly as pronounced as it is today. This means that whilst, as Jameson once joked, it is easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is for us to imagine the end of capitalism, there will be an end to capitalism. There will be an end to the idea of the nation state. The more we cling on to these ideas, the more violently their contradictions emerge. Therefore, Žižek's basic gambit, his Pascalian wager, essentially, is that it is worth believing in communism because capital and nationalism, and the link between capitalism and nationalist ideology, is itself a symptomatic emergence of a society in decline, of a society that is fading. That is essentially Žižek's death drive Marxism, which is to say, an analysis of capital and the ideology of capitalism seen through the lens of psychoanalysis, specifically the psychoanalysis of Lacan's going beyond the pleasure principle of surplus enjoyment and the death drive. And you can see that we can do this without Hegel. Like, you can actually explain this without having to interpret Hegel. Of course, what makes it more interesting is to reconstitute constitutive negativity and dialectical materialism seen through the lens of Žižek's Lacanian version of Hegel, which is being part of my project here. Anyway, that's about as much as I can explain in about half an hour. Thank you so much. I'm here in Houston, Texas, about to go outside and explore and see what the city has to offer. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for continuing to watch my YouTube videos. I'll try to keep making them more accessible. Like, my goal increasingly is to say, let's have these lectures be really technical, and let's find a way to make the YouTube videos a bit more accessible so that more people can enjoy them. All right, thank you guys so much, and if you're looking forward to downloading the complete guide to Žižek, that's going to be on my Patreon very soon. See you guys.